Uh-huh. I just feel like I've been around the block, ripping up fantasy stock, working around the clock. Look at the view from the top. Researching rookies a lot? No, I just be listening to pods. Yeah, one in particular, I'm just a messenger. Let me just pass on the rock. Browning, brunning, pruning, pronouncing ain't what he's doing. What he's doing is not losing, but infusing you with new things. And there's Dennis the Bennett, yeah. The man is a menace, yeah. Building a dynasty, some of the finest things. Promise you, you won't regret it. Sly as a fox, cultured in pop. Give him his props. Here is a thought, here is a box, and you cannot compare them at all. So don't even try. Careful with the news, but when you use a take, I take up Tony Fire. I mean Dyer, because anyone else is a huge mistake. Whoa, fantasy round table, fantasy round table, yeah. Fantasy round table. Come take a look at the crown, baby. Hey, fantasy round table, fantasy round table, woo. Fantasy round table. Come take a look at the crown, baby. Go.
Hello and welcome to the Fantasy Football Roundtable podcast. It is Monday. I don't know how it is for all of you, but it is sweltering here in Colorado. We got our first heat warning of the season, and that makes sense because things in the football world are heating up. We have plenty of hot stove news to go over today, which is good because we're also looking at the AFC South, which is a division that exists. Matt, Dennis, how was your weekend?
My weekend was pretty good. I successfully avoided doing much except mowing the yard. So went and saw an 80s hair band concert Friday night. Saw Slaughter. They sounded fantastic. Mark Slaughter's got a great voice still at almost 60 years old. You know, from where I was sitting, he still looked great. So it was a great show.
I was, a weekend
traveling.
Yeah. We got to make the best of it. I don't know if you guys know who. I imagine somebody has to know who Chip and Joanna Gaines are. Obviously, they have all that stuff through Baylor. My wife's a big fan of theirs, so we decided to stop in there on the way back and spend a couple hours there going through all their shops and all that stuff. So we get to have a little bit of fun out of it. But outside of that, I mean, I'm on vacation by the end of this week, so I needed to get here at this point.
Yeah, we were out there and went down to Waco to Chip and Joanna's, to the silos and stuff. Gosh, it's probably been 5 years ago, maybe longer than that. And it was about 4 or 5 years ago. My niece was graduating.
6 years ago for us, because I just got it popped up in our memory. We, for reasons surpassing understanding, decided to take a road trip through Texas in July.
Yeah, that's not smart.
I remember it being hot.
That's probably the best memory to have of the state.
Well, speaking of hot, things are heating up in the NFL. A lot of big news over the weekend, so we're going to hit you with all of it. First, Joe Mixon restructured his contract. Seems to have worked out a deal. We went into this off season thinking there was a chance. Maybe his long-term future wasn't there. Matt, I will start with you. How does this Mixon news hit you?
I mean, I think it's good for Mixon and good for the Bengals. I think it's not unfair to say that the running back room behind him has a lot of question marks. I mean, we know that this Bengals team is primed to try and go and win a Super Bowl. And, despite what we think in fantasy, he's really only had the one really, really good year for us in fantasy. We kept hoping and hoping he was going to repeat that. I think that he should have a pretty good year. He's a good receiver, really good running back. They improved the offensive line this offseason as well, bringing in, I believe it was the left tackle for the Chiefs last year who did a good job solidifying that line for them. So I think it's a great move for him, great move for the Bengals, who are on the cusp of winning a Super Bowl.
Yeah, to me, it made a lot of sense. And, we've been talking pretty much all off season. He's been a winner. What they did in free agency, what they did in the draft has basically said, look, we want to keep you and we have a budget and, we'll work to get something done. He took a pretty good pay cut. He stayed in a great situation. I like where Mixon's at, what he brings to the table. And to me, if you're a contender and you've got a short window, Joe Mixon is a great buy now, win now. If you can get him as your RB2, I think that's great.
Yeah, I think we all felt a little more confident seeing they didn't really go and get anyone. Now it seems like they certainly won't. And nice to see that worked out. I agree with you, Matt. I think that they are a Super Bowl contender. Probably good news for them. In another piece of running back news, Alvin Kamara agreed to a plea deal from his incident stemming from the just prior to the Pro Bowl 2 seasons ago. He's still subject to NFL discipline, but Dennis, are you feeling better or worse if you were rostering Kamara, and do you still expect a suspension?
I don't think it changed anything that we've been expecting. We've known that a resolution was going to come. We fully expected there's going to be likely a 6-game suspension. It seems now that it might even be 4 games instead of 6. It feels like he may get 6 and it gets dropped down to 4. He may get 4 and it gets dropped down to 3. He's going to be suspended for the first few games of the season. Probably the bigger issue is, where he's at in his career. How much work he's probably going to be more affected by just actual workload situation than he is by the suspension. They like Kendre Miller. I think he's the heir apparent to what Kamara does. I don't think Jamal Williams has a long runway. He's got a couple years of relevance left, maybe. I think last year might have been his peak season. That being said, they're going to have a very robust 3-headed monster for most of this year. I don't think we're going to see 81 receptions out of Kamara, and I don't think we're going to see an RB1 season out of him just based on the talent they have around him on that team. I think, he's a guy I want as my RB2 or 3 if I can help it. I'd rather have Mixon, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely going to be a suspension. We've seen the what is it conduct detrimental to the league, or however they get to pick and choose whatever they want. Doesn't matter how the court cases go. And we've seen them come down pretty hard on players as well that have some kind of video or evidence that is shown. We've seen the video of Kamara. We know it's out there. I don't think the plea deal is a good thing for him. It's not going to matter on the NFL side of things. I think he's probably going to get 2 to 4 games. I would not be surprised if Goodell comes down with 6, and then the NFLPA will fight it, and they'll probably knock it down to 4 or 2. I actually don't so I do think that they will probably use all 3 backs. I think Kendre is kind of dead now due to this with this Kamara, and I'm sure I know that they like him, but they don't bring in Jamal Williams on the contract that he has with the talent that he has as well. And Kamara, I mean, this is no shot at Kendre Miller. I think he's a very good running back. Both of them are better than him. I think that they are likely going to lean heavily on Williams being the number 1 guy and Miller getting some run until Kamara comes back. And I think Miller might get relegated to the bench because I do think Kamara still brings a skill talent to that running back room that neither Williams or Kendre can bring with his versatility in the receiving game. And the NFL has become a space and pace kind of game. They want to get those players with that pace into space, and that is what Alvin Kamara thrives at. And he's so much better at that than Jamal Williams and Kendre. So he's going to miss out on a couple games here, which I agree with Dennis is likely knocking him out of RB1 territory. But I would not be surprised if he ends up finishing as a pretty good RB2. Again, we saw, granted, different offense, different everything, but Derek Carr was not afraid to check down when he was with the Raiders, and I do think that they will use Alvin Kamara in that role.
Today was the franchise tag deadline, and we saw over the weekend Evan Ingram getting a 3-year deal for the Jaguars. Meanwhile, Saquon Barkley, Tony Pollard, and Josh Jacobs all are just going to have to settle for playing on the tag. So, Matt, I will start with you. What do you think of how franchise tag season settled out?
I mean, that's kind of what I expected. I know there were a lot of reports here the past couple of days that that the Cowboys and Pollard might come to a deal, so I thought maybe that would happen. I am a little surprised with Saquon, but I do get it with the fact that he's had those injuries for multiple years. He wanted a lot of money for what the running back position has kind of commanded over the past couple of years. I mean, I hate to say it, but it feels like the running back position is just, until the NFL finds or until the NFL values them again, like I just don't think these guys are going to get paid. I mean, I kind of expected Josh Jacobs not to get that deal. I think once he does show back up, we've talked about on here, I think he's going to get run into the ground this year, and then he'll be a free agent next year, and we'll see what happens. Evan Ingram was a little bit surprising to me. I feel like we weren't expecting that, but I wonder if this is more of a
if you thought Kendra Miller was dead, Brenton Strange is
I
buried in the coffin underneath him.
Not to what's dang it, what's it called when you make a pun out of something, a name? That was the strangest pick in the draft, was what I was going to say. No pun intended or whatever. That was a very weird pick. I mean, Evan Ingram, I think, is a very good player when he's used correctly. We saw that last year in Jacksonville. We saw it his rookie year in New York. Him getting a 3-year deal, I mean, it makes sense for that offense. We know Doug Peterson loves to have multiple tight ends out there, and I think he fits well with what that offense does. I actually think this could be more of an indictment on Calvin Ridley. The fact that they were willing to go out and pay Evan Ingram, this Ridley kind of the new guy coming in. I know a lot of people are high on him. He's old already as it is. Like he's a guy I probably wouldn't be betting on. Maybe I'm reading too much into the Ingram contract. I like it, though, for that offense. Again, it just gives Trevor Lawrence another weapon for him to hopefully have that bounce back year. And we'll see what happens with Barkley and Jacobs. I mean, with the new what was it? The new NFLPA stuff and everything they signed a couple years ago. These guys can't hold out. So I don't know what they're going to do. They're going to have to either sign it or lose game. Was it game? No, won't lose game checks, but they'll lose money. It's going to be interesting to see what happens when they hit free agency.
So with Barkley and Jacobs, they don't lose money because they're not under contract. So, but if they don't return by week 10, they also don't gain any seniority towards whatever benefits they earn. So they can't be fined for not being under contract. At least that's the way I understand it. To me, I think it's a terrible financial decision. Now, I think they'll probably hold out through most of camp, sign the last week. They're going to make $10 million. It's not anything to sneeze at. The market sucks for running backs, and there's no way around it. Right now, and the deck is stacked against running backs because let's say they decide after 2 years that they want to get the extension because that's when they're at their best is 2 or 3 seasons in. Well, that's when they get hurt by the big fines for missing camp and missing games. That's where the hammer will come down. So they really, the collective bargaining has kind of taken all of that leverage away from them. So unless they just want to sit out and not get paid and go into next year as a free agent and risk being tagged again, I don't know if it would count as the second tag where it gets a 10% increase or something like that. I don't know that would how that would work. To me, I feel like Jacobs, because the Raiders are going to suck, Jacobs has more incentive to hold out than Saquon Barkley does. But I feel like they're both going to be in. My Scott Fishbowl team certainly hopes that Josh Jacobs makes it in and plays well. I could see them franchising Barkley next year. I don't think McDaniel, if he makes it through this year, franchises Jacobs for a second year. And the Evan Ingram contract, probably the weirdest part of that to me is that it's cumbersome to get out of. I mean, you think, a lot of times they're going to load the money up in the first year so they can get out of it. Well, the dead cap next year is $19.5 million. And in year 3, they can get out of it, but then it's still $13.5 million in dead cap. So it feels to me like Doug Peterson has said, when I was in Philadelphia, I had a lot of success with 2 tight ends. And I've got one that I know is good. And he already has rapport with Trevor Lawrence. I like Brenton Strange enough that we took him higher, probably than a lot of people felt. So it seems like he's trying to recreate that Philadelphia offense. he's got some good wide receivers. Stock up with a couple tight ends. Got a couple good running backs. Let's see how it rolls. But yeah, Ingram will be 31 when this contract expires. So this was his deal.
I think for me, the only one I was surprised they didn't do better about getting a deal done was Pollard, just because Dallas seemed to push all their chips in and say he's our guy and moving on from Ezekiel Elliott. And if they don't franchise tag him next year and can't work out a deal, it's possible that they go from having 2 good running backs to 0 running backs in 2 years, which also does feel like the most Dallas move of all time. The other big piece of news, and we'll dive into more of the fantasy implications since the Titans are one of our teams today, is DeAndre Hopkins agreeing to a 2-year contract with the Tennessee Titans. So I guess my big question for you guys, and I'll start with you, Dennis, is were you surprised by the choice to go to Tennessee?
Well, when he first went there and we talked about it, I mentioned him and Vrabel overlapped for 4 or 5 years in Houston. So they have an established relationship. One thing he's going to be in Tennessee is the number one option. Vrabel is a salesman like any other coach. And I get that he said he wanted to go to an elite quarterback and he wanted to go where he could win a Super Bowl. Tennessee's defense was kind of middling last year. Good against the run, terrible against the pass, or vice versa. I forget. I think against the run, they gave up the fewest yards per attempt. And against the pass, they were one of the worst teams in the league. So they know where their weaknesses are. They have to build that side of the ball. That comes from getting pressure on the quarterback. Running the ball last year, when they lost Derrick Henry, that was an issue. Their offense is what it is. Adding DeAndre Hopkins is going to help Derrick Henry. It also is going to give them a little more versatility. Mike Clay, God bless him, already has redone his projections, and he has Hopkins as wide receiver 21 and Burks as, I think, wide receiver 41. So a low-end wide receiver 2 and a mid wide receiver 4, and that feels about right. Could they surprise and throw the ball a little bit more than we think? They added Skoronski to the offensive line. They could. Chig, I think, is the big loser because now the number 2 role is going to be divided up between Okonkwo and Burks. And if I remember correctly, I think Clay still had Burks getting 94 targets this year after adding DeAndre Hopkins. I think that's reasonable. I think, Hopkins, I was looking, SpotTrack doesn't have the details of Hopkins' contract. We know what the total amount is, but I don't know if there's a way for them to get out of it after 1 year or what. But it's crazy that DeAndre Hopkins is getting paid more than Saquon Barkley. I think Barkley might be more valuable to his team. And, Tennessee, it's going to be a season of winning ugly. That's what they do. That's what Mike Vrabel does. He's going to piece that defense together. And if they can keep things close, we know Hopkins can make plays. That's what he's done his whole career, if he can stay healthy. If they get a 4-point lead, they can grind it out with first downs between Hopkins and Derrick Henry. I think the team, while I haven't went back and updated my projection for wins and losses, when we get there, I'm going to talk a little more about that.
Yeah, it's an interesting signing. I don't think that this offense is, at least from a fantasy perspective, anything we're really buying into. Ryan Tannehill, maybe this helps him out a lot, getting that kind of dominant wide receiver that can go up and get the ball like A.J. Brown could. He's not going to be able to challenge downfield like A.J. Brown was. I don't think he's bringing you the yak like A.J. Brown did. But he's a very good Hall of Fame. I do think actually he's a Hall of Fame wide receiver, but I meant to say just wide receiver. I had this conversation with someone the other day. He's actually in the first 10 years of his career, he's top 10 in yards in the first 10 years. I mean, he's ahead of multiple Hall of Famers. He's right up there with Calvin Johnson and Larry Fitzgerald. I mean, he's had a very good career. And, he said in an interview recently, had he not gotten injured, he would have gone over 1,000 yards last year. And he would have. He was over almost 800 yards in 9 games. I mean, he likely was going for 1,000 yards again. There was only 2 years, I think, if I remember correctly, out of 10 that he has not gone over 1,000 yards. And one of them, he only played 4 games. He had 500 yards receiving. So, I mean, the dude is an absolute beast. Maybe it helps Burks in having a guy that defense can, I think they'll focus on him being the one. I honestly don't know. I think I'm probably avoiding both of them, and we'll talk a little bit about their values right now. Hopkins' value is going to shoot up because everybody's kind of out on Treylon Burks, and now that he's there, they're going to talk themselves into him being the one. I mean, we were going to talk about it today anyways. I was going to tell everybody to fade Chig to begin with. Vrabel has not met an athletic tight end that he doesn't love and doesn't know how to use. Chig is Jonnu Smith all over again. Why people were talking themselves into him, I have no idea, but that's what he was going to be. And then adding DeAndre Hopkins just kills his value even more.
Well, it's time to dive right in. And you know what? I'm going to do the teams in reverse since we are on the Titans so much right now. Might as well just kind of finish that out. So the Tennessee Titans finished 7-9, second in the AFC South. Key additions, they got Chris Moore at wide receiver. They obviously just picked up DeAndre Hopkins at wide receiver, Arden Key, the linebacker, and Andre Dillard, a tackle. Key losses, if you can call it that, Robert Woods, wide receiver, went to the Texans. Austin Hooper, the tight end, went to the Raiders. Bud Dupree, the linebacker, went to the Falcons. In the draft, they got Pierre Skoronski, a offensive tackle. They picked up Will Levis at QB and Tyjae Spears at running back. Key fantasy assets, Ryan Tannehill was quarterback 27 last year, missed a few games down the stretch. Malik Willis, who they drafted in the 3rd round last year, finished as quarterback 52. And Will Levis is obviously also there, was not in the NFL last year. Derrick Henry, the big powerhouse for them on the ground, finished as running back 4. Tyjae Spears is the other potential running back there. At the wide receiver, DeAndre Hopkins currently going as finished as wide receiver 47 last year, missing some games due to suspension and then injury with Arizona. Treylon Burks finished as wide receiver 81 in his rookie year. Nick Westbrook at Keeney finished as wide receiver 89. Chris Moore, who was actually with a different team, finished as wide receiver 60, is the second best finishing wide receiver on this roster. And Kyle Phillips, who had like a game or two, finished as wide receiver 163 last year. Chig Okonkwo finished as tight end 25. So, Matt, I'm just going to start right with you. What do you expect from this offense? And what do you expect at quarterback? Rumors already that Malik Willis is out playing Will Levis.
I mean, that's honestly not surprising. I mean, I guess it's a little bit surprising. If I had to pick one or the other, I would say Will Levis is better. But I did not think Will Levis was uber talented to begin with. And I do think, making the transition, we've talked about it before, making the transition from college to NFL is hard enough as it is. Malik Willis already knows the offense, has been in the NFL for a year. I do think that gives him a tad bit of a step up. What I think about this offense is I think they're just going to be okay again. I mean, adding DeAndre Hopkins, I do think brings that passing game a little bit more upside. Since they lost A.J. Brown last year, don't get me wrong, was a fan of Robert Woods for a long time. Clearly, he just didn't have it last year. Treylon Burks, a rookie. He was also, I believe he was injured for a couple of games last year as well. So, he really didn't get the chance to ascend and take over the number 1 role. I do think that's where Hopkins is going to come in, but I just don't think that they're going to pass it enough. I mean, the one thing I will say for Hopkins as he's aged, and I do think his game ages well because he's such a good route runner and finds ways to create separation, he does need volume to really produce. We saw that in Arizona. It felt like if Kyler Murray was throwing 10 passes on a drive, 9 of them were going, probably 9.5 of them were going to Hopkins. The half one was just an overthrow and somebody else caught it. Like they were going to Hopkins every play. Maybe Tennessee does that, but they do have Derrick Henry back there, and I don't think he's going to see a massive fall off. I know he struggled toward the end of last year. I personally don't think this is the year that Henry's going to fall off. Vrabel wants to win ugly. He just does. He always has. We've seen 1 year of this flashy offense with Arthur Smith, and it went away from that. He wants to win with defense in the run game. And I do think he has the team to do that. And I do think that they will do that. I had Tennessee, I think, winning like 4 games last year. They're probably going to win the South. Vrabel just does a great job coaching. It's something, that I think he gets a little bit overlooked for with how great a job he does coaching, especially with how bad this defense has been at times. But he continually puts out a very good product for the Tennessee Titans. They continue to be a very well-coached team, and they continue to be very good. But I do think it's going to be predicated on the run and defense. I don't think this passing game is going to be that good. If I had to pick an asset that I think will have a good year and a player that I'm betting on, it's probably Derrick Henry over everybody else on this roster.
Yeah, I agree. Now, the one thing Tannehill does is Tannehill is pretty accurate. He has, let's see, where'd that one go? So Tannehill has completed over, 64% of his passes in the last 6 years. Last season, he missed 5 games. And while Tennessee's offense was only ahead of the Falcons and the Bears when it came to passing attempts, I mean, to me, that feels like it was Malik Willis. They thought so much of Malik Willis that they literally signed Josh Dobbs off a practice squad and started him the same week. And Dobbs acquitted himself fairly well. Now, that being said, I think they're going to surprise us a little bit. And where I actually had them at an 8-9 record going back. I'm probably going to end up putting them up about 10 wins. I don't think they're going to be better than Jacksonville. So they're going to have to get in as a wild card. It's possible they do that. Derrick Henry is he's the show there. Last season, he, though, was down from 27 carries a game in 21 to just under 22 carries a game last year. He's still picking up lots of yards. He's still getting in the end zone. And his targets went up last year. If they continue to involve him, I don't think they're going to go away from Derrick Henry. I agree with you, Matt. As much as I want to be getting out of the Henry business a year too early, honestly, I don't know if this year is a year too early. He may still he's just, as the kids like to say, he's built different. Will that injury from 2 years ago, is that stuff that's going to start to pop up more frequently? But he's 28 years old last year, going to be 29 this year. I don't know. Will Tyjae Spears be good enough to relieve some of that pressure? Another great question. It seems like we've already completely written off Hassan Haskins and Julius Chestnut, probably rightfully so. But I could see them increasing their passing attempts a little bit, getting up over 500 attempts a game, or a season, excuse me. Like last year, the Titans threw 456 passes. So getting over 500 isn't a huge lift. Getting up to 525, 530, 550, I don't think it's that big a lift if they're playing well. It'll all come down to what the offensive line does, and if the defense can hold teams close. If they keep getting beat, maybe they have to throw a lot more, as opposed to grinding it out with Henry. It's going to be a very, very game script dependent season for the Titans, and I'm not ready to hedge my bets one way or another how it's going to play out. I just feel like adding Hopkins might, he might have that, he's got that Reggie Jackson kind of mentality. He's the straw that stirs the drink. So we'll see what happens.
I think so far I've learned that you guys are a lot more bullish on Tennessee than I am. I also saw an interesting graphic that Tennessee is where Hall of Fame receivers go to die. And they put up like a lot of pictures of some bigger players, including like Randy Moss.
I thought that was the Raiders.
Well, no, Randy Moss went to the Titans after the Raiders. So Julio Jones So that gave me a little bit of pause. But Dennis, I'll start back with you. What would be your pick for value? And I'm going to tell you, looking at the ADPs, there are not, Chigakonkwo going as tight end 11 currently. Hopkins was already going as wide receiver 22, even if he comes up a little bit. I mean, Burks was going as wide receiver 34 already. Henry running back 8. So do you see any values you like on the Titans?
So in Dynasty Nerds ADP, Hopkins was going as wide receiver 39. This is startup Dynasty ADP. Mike Clay's got him at wide receiver 21. And it comes down to, what do you believe the runway is going to be on this? Is the burn rate going to be like it's these 2 years and it's crash and burn and he turns into Julio Jones? Do you think he'll be able to, because he's never won with speed, will he be able to continue? Can he make the Larry Fitzgerald transition, become a big slot, and continue to win for the next 5 to 7 years? I think that's going to be the real question. If you believe that, wide receiver 39 in Dynasty is a steal, because he's probably going to be able to stay in that wide receiver, 18 to 30 range for the next few years. If you believe that, Derrick Henry, RB 17, he's RB 4 in the Fantasy Pros ADP. There's a big gap there, because Dynasty players, they're not drafting him early. They're willing to draft him, but they're not willing to draft him at running back 4. It'll be interesting to see where Treylon Burks falls to. Finished as wide receiver 81. Actually, I misspoke. Henry's actually RB8 on Fantasy Pros. But Treylon Burks is wide receiver 34 on Fantasy Pros, and coming off at wide receiver 25 in Dynasty Nerds. I think that's going to start to sync up a little more. I think Okonkwo is going to fall. So for me, it ends up being Derrick Henry and DeAndre Hopkins, honestly, are the values there. And Henry's probably going to be more expensive. I don't think in a real startup you would get him at RB 17. I still think you'd have to take him in the top 10 running backs to get him. But at RB 10, I still think that's fair value, a little bargain.
I mean, to me, there's really only 2 bargains, and it really just kind of depends on what you want to do with them. So looking at Fantasy Pros ADP, DeAndre Hopkins is still going fairly high. I don't remember. He's still going as a wide receiver 19 off the board, which I don't think is a value. Treylon Burks is going off the board as wide receiver 36. I do think that's somewhat of a value, because he will be the second option. We saw the chemistry and the connection that Ryan Tannehill and A.J. Brown had. I do think that Treylon Burks does have some of that in his game. Now, whether or not that will be realized, I don't know, but I would rather pay for the cheaper option personally in this offense. The other one is Ryan Tannehill. I mean, he's going off the board as QB 32. He's going to outperform that. Now, I'm going to be honest, I don't understand this dude's contract at all. I am looking at it, and it shows that he will be getting paid in 24 and 25. But then it says that those will be automatically voided, and it will be $9.2 million of dead cap hit toward the Titans, and then he can become a free agent after the 2024 season. So there's still a chance that he is on the Titans again next year, because I don't think Malik Willis is the answer, and I hate to break it to people, I don't think Will Levis is either. So there is a shot, even in Dynasty, that you're getting 2 more years of Ryan Tannehill with his rushing upside. Dennis mentioned how accurate he can be. You added DeAndre Hopkins. I do think that Tannehill is going to outperform QB 32 for at least the next 2 seasons. And I do think he's good enough to land as a backup somewhere.
Yeah, next year they're going to be starting Carson Wentz.
Carson Wentz isn't even currently on an NFL roster. So there's that. He and Cam must be having fun somewhere. I think what you're seeing with that ADP with Tannehill is if you look at Levis, who's going as QB 37, it's got to be baked in that a lot of people think that Ryan Tannehill isn't playing the whole season. But I'm right there with you, Matt. If he plays the whole season, he's going to be better than quarterback 32. And I'm not sold that one of these other two guys is the answer. It's an interesting situation, especially if Tennessee is competing. If they bottom out and they look like they're well out of it, maybe they will just turn it over and see what they got to make some changes. But if they're hanging on around there, and I don't think, even though I like the Jaguars, who we're going to talk about, I don't think they're going to run away with the division. Tennessee will probably hang tough, and you'll see a lot of Tannehill. Matt, how do you think the Titans will finish this season?
So I've got them at 9-8. They don't necessarily have a fairly easy schedule getting the AFC North. Obviously, I do think the Colts will be a decent team by the end of the year who they play. Jags, I do think, are going to be their main competition for the division. They obviously play twice, but they also get the Seahawks and the Dolphins as some of their out-of-conference games, which I do think will both be very hard games. I mean, the Dolphins, I think, are going to be one of the better teams in the AFC. And I do think that the Seahawks, if they're able to replicate what they did last year, will not be an easy win for them as well. So I think that there's probably 8-ish losses on the schedule, so I'm going to give them a 9 and an 8 record.
I have them sitting at 8 and 9 right now. I'm kind of looking through the schedule to figure out, where would they grab a couple more wins. I think week 17, I think they'll beat Houston in Houston. So that puts them at 9 and 8. I don't see them going into Pittsburgh and winning in week 9. That's going to be a challenge. Do they win? Do they beat the Ravens in England? I don't know. Do they go on the road and beat the Colts? Again, that's another tough one. I'm not sure. I think right now my first pass, I'm going to give them 9 and 8. But I feel like there's going to be at least one more win in there. And I feel, maybe I've got one too many wins on Jacksonville at 12 and 5. So maybe if I drop a win or two off of Jacksonville, that makes a little more sense for the division. So I'm going to go with 9 and 8.
I don't know if it's just me, but there's felt like a weird energy with Tennessee. I don't know how rock solid I feel about Vrabel's position there. Tannehill staying there long term. We know that they at one point were trying to move on from Derrick Henry. Grabbing DeAndre Hopkins does feel like they're going to give one last run. Before the Hopkins signing, when I did my track, I only had them with 5 wins, and honestly, I still feel like 7 or 8 wins is it. I don't think they're a playoff team, even with DeAndre Hopkins. Maybe they rally and they have some magic, but I actually think Houston will be more interesting with some of the changes they made. I still like the Colts roster. And I think the Jaguars are a better team. I'm still not sold that Tennessee is close to the best team in its division. We'll go back to the beginning and look at the Jacksonville Jaguars. In 2022, the Jaguars finished 9 and 8, first in the AFC South. They lost in the divisional round of the playoffs after beating the Chargers in the wild card round. Key additions, they picked up Dearness Johnson at running back from the Browns, and they picked up Brandon McManus at kicker. For key losses, Marvin Jones, their wide receiver, went to the Lions. Dan Arnold, the tight end, went to the Eagles. Jawan Taylor, their right tackle, went to the Chiefs. And Chris Manhertz, another of their tight ends, went to the Broncos. In the draft, they picked up Anton Harrison at tackle, Brenton Strange, who we've mentioned a couple of times, at tight end, Tank Bigsby at running back, and Parker Washington at wide receiver. Key fantasy assets: Trevor Lawrence finished as QB8 last year. Travis Etienne was running back 17 last year. They also added Tank Bigsby, who was not there last year. Dearness Johnson was running back 138 for Cleveland last year. And Michael Hasty, who actually was ended up being the number 2 after Robinson left, finished as running back 62. A wide receiver, they traded for Calvin Ridley last year, despite him being on a season-long suspension, so he will play his first game as a Jaguar this year. Christian Kirk came over as a free agent last year, finished as wide receiver 12. Zay Jones, another free agent, finished as wide receiver 26. And they also added Parker Washington, who is a rookie. At tight end, Evan Ingram, who we mentioned, just signed a 3-year extension, finished as tight end 5 last year, and they also added Brenton Strange. So, Dennis, I'll start with you. What are your fantasy expectations for the Jaguars, and what do you make of this wide receiver group?
So I love Trevor Lawrence this year. Right now, he's sitting kind of in that somewhere between QB 7 and 10, depending on where you're looking at ADP and rankings. I feel, he's 6'6". He's very mobile. He's got a great arm. Second year in the Doug Peterson offense. I expect him to take a step. It was QB 8 last year. Dynasty Nerds ADP has him going off at QB 7, Fantasy Pros at QB 8. I think he has top 4 probably potential this season even. Definitely has a chemistry with Evan Ingram. Looked great with Zay Jones and Christian Kirk last year. So does signing Calvin Ridley propel them to take that next step? Seems like they're, bringing in Brenton Strange. They're looking at the 2 tight end stuff, so maybe that kind of gives them some flexibility at wide receiver. I think they're going to start the year with Travis Etienne as their primary back. And I think as the season goes on, Tank Bigsby's going to eat into that. JaMychal Hasty might even eat into that with his passing game chops. I like what they're doing and how they're building this offense, and I think it's going to be really, really good for fantasy. Evan Ingram at tight end 13, I don't know that he's got that top 5 upside, but tight end 13 feels like it could be a little bit low this year. Calvin Ridley, he's coming off wide receiver 16 in Fantasy Pros. That feels high. But in Dynasty Nerds, Dynasty ADPs, wide receiver 27, that feels a little more palatable. I think at wide receiver 27, you've got a little bit of room for upside. I don't think you've got a ton. I don't know that he's going to, be in the top 15 or top 18. He could move into a low-end wide receiver too. But finishing as wide receiver 12 last year with Christian Kirk, that feels like impossible. He's coming off a wide receiver 25, wide receiver 37 for Dynasty Nerds. That is, somewhere in that 25 to 37 range. I think it's more going to be more at the bottom end of that. I don't know how. I'm trying to figure out, is one of those guys going to step up and be an alpha? I think we saw last year Christian Kirk wants to be, but he's like a chihuahua. He's mean as hell, but when it comes to you get him in a back alley, he makes a lot of noise and he flails a lot. He just ain't going to knock anybody out. And I don't know that Calvin Ridley has that either. And so then maybe that bodes well for Evan Ingram. Evan Ingram, he might become the red zone guy. Zay Jones has some size to him. He's 6'3", but I feel like he peaked last year. Currently coming off at wide receiver 176 in Fantasy Pros, and not even registering on that was Parker Washington. Wide receiver 58 on Fantasy Pros, wide receiver 90 on Dynasty Nerds. I feel like 90 is too low. 58 might be too high because I don't think he's going to get consistent enough volume. He feels like a best ball guy is what he feels like.
I'm intrigued to see what this offense looks like in its second year with Doug Peterson. I mean, I know everybody is expecting Trevor Lawrence to be good, but let's not overlook the fact that he had a very up and down season last year. He was not this solidified asset that a lot of people kind of claim he was coming into the year. I mean, multiple games with no touchdowns, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 games last year with 0 touchdowns, multiple interceptions in those games. In fact, he only had 3 games over 3 touchdowns. or 3 touchdowns or more. He had some pretty rough games last year, including closing out the season, not even counting the playoff game where I believe he threw 4 interceptions in the first half to the Los Angeles Chargers defense. Just 229 yards, 0 touchdowns, 0 interceptions, 152 yards and an interception to the Houston Texans, and then 1 touchdown for 212 yards, which I believe that was the game that solidified them at least the division against Tennessee in the last game of the season. I do expect him to take a step forward. I do not have Trevor Lawrence quite as high. We know that he was a rushing quarterback in college. It does not seem like he's going to be doing much of that in the NFL, and I don't blame him. I honestly don't want to see my quarterbacks running that much, but the most rushing yards he had last year was 53. Like, he's not going to be a guy that brings you a ton of rushing upside. In fact, we've talked about it before, or at least I've talked about it before. Those quarterbacks that seem to be in like the top 5 to 8 when it comes to fantasy either have over 300 to 350 rushing yards a season or are volume passers. I don't think Trevor Lawrence is either one of those. And last year, he only had 209 rushing yards and 5 touchdowns. I don't think he's taken that step forward, and I don't think he's going to be a volume passer. I do think that they're going to continue to lean on the run game. That's why they brought in a guy like Tank Bigsby. I'm intrigued to see what this offense looks like. Christian Kirk was good for them last year, right? I do think Evan Ingram getting that new contract is a good thing for him, good thing for this offense. Zay Jones had his moments last year. We'll see if Calvin Ridley can help this offense out some. Again, I've mentioned, this is 2 years out of football now. I don't know how easy it's going to be for him to come back and just jump in this offense and be this asset everybody thinks he's going to be. I've said before, and I think I'll say it here again, I wouldn't be surprised if he doesn't do anything this year. It's not easy for these guys to come back and be studs after missing that much time in the NFL. In my opinion, Deshaun Watson at his position as an infinite better player than Calvin Ridley is. And look at how bad he looked last year. And we're expecting Calvin Ridley to just come out there and do something. I don't. I think this offense is going to be closer to middle of the pack than it seems like most people in the fantasy space do. Maybe I'm not giving Trevor Lawrence his due in the possible step forward that he can take, but at this point, I need to see it. I mean, this is his, 3rd year in the NFL? And while I do think that, obviously, from his rookie season to last year, he took a step forward, he has to take another step forward again because he, at least in my opinion, didn't show me that he can be this elite asset last year, even with the offense and the way that things went. That's it. Sorry. I thought I had another point, but that was it.
Every time I get excited about Calvin Ridley, you're just there to make me a little bit nervous. All those teams where I held him, I'm like, this is going to be no, there's Matt just to make me feel better about myself. So looking at some of the ADPs, Matt, is there anyone that jumps out to you that you feel like is a good value on the Jaguars?
I mean, I like it. It's not really a value at tight end 8. It's probably close to what he's going to be. If I had to pick one player, I'd probably go Christian Kirk. I mean, for the season he had last year, he's coming off the board at wide receiver 29, which is 8 spots behind Calvin Ridley, who, again, I'm not going to go back into everything I just said, but I think there's a much better opportunity that Christian Kirk scores more fantasy points this year than Calvin Ridley. I'm not saying Calvin Ridley can't be the guy for this team in the future. I just think we're asking a lot of a guy who's been out of football for 2 years to jump in and be the number one for this offense. So probably Christian Kirk. I didn't see I was trying to find Travis Etienne's. I know he's going fairly high. Wide running back 14, that's probably too high, but I guess fair value. I don't think he's going to finish that high either. So if I had to pick one player in this offense, it's probably going to be Christian Kirk.
I'm all about that Tank Bigsby business. Coming off Fantasy Pros at RB 45 and at Dynasty Nerds RB 38. I feel like he's going to have a top 30 season as a rookie. He's going to be the goal line back. He's going to be the first and second down back. And if he shows to be any kind of capable at wide receiver, he could end up with 30% target share for the running backs. I get it. ETN has the explosiveness, but you have to, I think at running back, you just got to be able to do more. And they went and got Bigsby to fill all the holes that ETN couldn't. And I think he's going to lead the team in carries and lead the team in rushing touchdowns. And I think he finishes inside the top top 30 in running backs.
But man, I thought Etienne was one of your favorite receivers.
Etienne can't catch the ball.
Yes. If you want to see more about that, just follow Matt or Austin Nace on Twitter. They made some comments about that this week. So Dennis, I'll come back to you. How do you have the Jaguars finishing?
So I've got them at a crisp first place in the division, 11-6. I feel like 10-7 might be the number. But kind of looking back through it, I didn't feel like there was really a spot for me to grab another one without digging in a little bit deeper. And so when I did my records, I kind of went through and I kind of did it quick and dirty and said, how do I feel about this game? And then I kind of did a second pass after looking at the records and thinking, okay, probably not going to be a winless team and a one-win team. So let's kind of work this out a little bit. And, I had way too many 14-win teams. And so after going back through it a little bit, before today, I had the Jags at 12-5. I think 11-6, 10-7 is probably more reasonable. I got them at 11-6 right now.
I think we're going to see deja vu all over again. And that week 18 game with the Jags and the Titans, I think are going to be battling for the division again. They have a tough schedule. Again, the AFC North, who I do think has 4 teams that could legitimately all be in playoff spots or challenging for them. On top of that, some of their out-of-conference games they get. The 49ers, the Chiefs, the Bills. Those are all 3 very tough games. And in my opinion, I mentioned the 49ers, the 49ers. The Colts, again, Matt, you talked about you think they're going to have a good year. I do too. I think they're going to get a couple of these teams, especially later in the season. And they do, unfortunately, or for them, fortunately, lucky enough, play them both their games early in the season. Week 6 is their second matchup. So maybe Anthony Richardson and this team hasn't quite taken off yet, so they don't get him there. But I do think that could possibly be a losable game there as well, which gets me to about 8 losses. I think they're going to be right around 9-8, maybe 10-7, and they take the division outright. But I do think they're going to be battling with the Titans all year long to get that division.
Yeah, I had them at 10-7. I think they win, but I don't think that they are a dominant team. They weren't really a dominant team last year. They kind of caught fire down the stretch. They might be a little bit more even going through, but they're playing that first place schedule, as you mentioned. They also get the Bengals in there, so they have to play the Bills, the Chiefs, and the Bengals, 49ers. I think some of their division games are always interesting, and you always play divisional opponent stuff too. So I think that they will be in the playoffs and they'll end up winning that division, but I don't think it's going to be a walk away by any stretch of the imagination. That'll do it for us for the top of the AFC South. We will have the bottom half of the AFC South, the Colts and the Texans, coming up on Friday. But Dennis, if people are just painfully waiting for camp to start and trying to look for something to fill these non-football days, what can they do?
Well, teams start reporting this week. It's a big week. Very, very exciting week. And so they can go ahead and give us a follow on Twitter at the Roundtable FF. They can subscribe to the podcast, download, listen, leave us a rating and a review. We love that shit.
And if you take anything away from today, it's that Travis Etienne's a great receiver and Calvin Ridley's going to have a top 5 season. And none of those dreams have been crushed by people on this show. Until we meet again, have a wonderful week.